You're about to listen to an archived episode of The Night Shift with Zeno Horoman. This is brought to you commercial-free by the Surfcast Podcast. If you're interested in more historical, educational, and entertaining surf fishing content, check out weekly episodes of the Surfcast Podcast available today on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you get your podcasts, including www.surfcastpodcast.com.
Today I have a great pleasure of welcoming Gary Soldati. As most of you know, Gary makes extremely popular line of plugs under big water pikes, and I'm psyched to find out more about how he does it, how he fishes, where he fishes. So let's welcome Gary Soldati.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. It's nice to be here.
I know you started fly fishing and then eventually you gravitated to surf. You did a lot of bluefish during the day, you told me. I know you did a lot of block fishing, a lot of eel fishing, but there's still a big progression from a surf fisherman to a lure builder. Tell us about how did that all came about?
I live 3 hours from open ocean. I did a lot of fishing, but it was all freshwater. No saltwater fishing whatsoever, even on vacation. Collected shells, enjoyed the ocean, but no fishing. And I started vacationing in a cottage that sat right on a harbor. You could actually throw a stone into the water from the deck. This was back in the early 80s, and there were a lot of big bluefish coming into the harbor chasing bunker. And I was sitting on the porch one afternoon, and a big school of bunker came right up to the rocks of the cottage, and a guy in a little boat came from the opposite shore. He casted a bare hook into that school of bunker, snagged a bunker, and I know what he's doing. I'm a fisherman, even though I'm not a saltwater fisherman. I watch him snag a bunker, and then he proceeded to catch bluefish after bluefish. And that intrigued me because there was an old spinning rod at the cottage, and I'm thinking I can do that because the bunker right up next to the shore. I can do that from shore. If nothing else, it'd be fun to try. So the next day, the bunker came back, followed by the bluefish. I snagged a bunker and ended up catching a 7-pound blue, which to date was one of the biggest fish that I had caught. Because remember now, I'm a freshwater fly fisherman, and it's fishing small streams. I'm blown away by this. I'm showing everybody in the cottage and around in that area, we're not fishermen, so they're thinking, wow, fish, that's a good sized fish. So I went right out and bought a bigger spinning rod. So now I've got 2 spinning rods, an old beat up one that was with the cottage, and now I'm out there with 2 spinning rods waiting for the bunker to come. So that happened in August, and by November I was at Montauk, and the course went from Branford Harbor in Connecticut to Hammonasset Jetty in Connecticut, where they did a run of big bluefish. And I was talking to a guy on the jetty, and he said, if you like surf fishing, you should go to Rhode Island. And I had a friend in town that used to vacation in Watch Hill, Rhode Island. So he told me how to get there. I drove into Watch Hill, Rhode Island, checked into an old inn, and I said, where should we fish? And she said, well, go right down to the lighthouse, park in front of the no parking sign, and then just go over the seawall, which I did. When I got down there, there's boats going back and forth. There's schools of bunker going by. And there's guys catching, bluefish, mid-teen bluefish right off the seawall. So I'm thinking, wow, if there's that many fish in Rhode Island, then, I don't need to fish right now. I'll come back later. So I came back later in the afternoon, and the last school of bunker was going by the seawall, hooked up on a popper, caught a bluefish, maybe 12 pounds. And that was the last bunker school I saw in Rhode Island. It was on the downturn of the bunker. They were netting up all the bunker at that time. That was 1981. And I never saw it like that again.
This was during time when striper fishing was on the way down, I assume. And there was a lot more bluefish than bass, right?
My first 5 years of surf fishing, this is a learning curve for me now too. I'm going from freshwater fly fishing to surf casting and basically, soaking bunker chunks and fishing during the day. So in my first 5 years, I didn't see a striper, let alone catch one. And then I said, come on, we got to change this up. I needed to fish eels. So my first eel fishing experience was a nightmare. I went out to a place I hadn't fished before, which turned out to be very shallow. I dumped the eels out on the ground. And of course, they all went in a different direction, and it was just getting dark. And then I'm trying to pick up an eel. The guy showed me how to hook it, but in a bare, wet hand, that was an experience. So then I learned to, get my hand all sandy, and I hooked the eel. By the time I ended up casting it, it was in a knot. Needless to say, for those first 12 eels, I never even had a hit. They all died that night, and the ones I didn't lose and casting. But then, from there, I fished eels for the next 20 years, and I fished live eels. I fished a couple times where I fished rigged eels, but I was a live eel fisherman, and I did one thing then that I see very few people do now, just kind of watching them, is I see guys buy some eels, buy 2 or 3 eels, and then they've got a bag full of plugs. And then, they take a few casts with the eels and they don't get anything. Then they're switching over to plugs and then they're back to eels. And pretty soon they haven't caught anything. When I fished eels, that's all I fished. I had 2 needlefish in my back in case I lost my eels or I got chopped up by bluefish. And only then would I switch over to a plug. As long as I had eels, that's all I fished.
Which brings me to the point that you are known for basically fishing your own plugs, which is great, but very unusual. I mean, most other people like to mix it up, and I understand what you're saying exactly. So the progression from an eel fisherman to a lure fisherman happened how?
I came from an artificial background. I liked fishing flies. There was a short period of time where I went from bunker chunks to plugs. And, every time I went into a tackle shop to find out how the fishing was, I'd buy a couple plugs. So I had quite an array of big plugs. The guys I ended up meeting in Rhode Island kind of took me under their wing. And they were all big plug fishermen because there was a lot of bunker at that point. The bunker was the primary striper bait at that time. Very few sand eels, no peanut bunker. So I had an experience of fishing big plugs, to match the bait. So when I had fished eels for 20 years, I realized that I was getting complacent. I was catching a lot of fish on eels, but not the size fish that I thought I should be catching. Fishing at that time, Block Island, a lot every season. I needed to change it up. So I did. I said, I'm going to stop fishing eels. I'm going to go back to plugs, but I'm going to fish big plugs because I've caught a lot of fish, so now I want to focus on catching big fish. And I think that's the progression of fishing. You look to catch as many fish as you can, and then you start focusing on bigger fish, and then maybe selective on how you're going to fish for those fish. I decided to fish big plugs, but the problem was by the time I went back to fishing plugs, primary bait was sand eels. There were very few bunker around. They all got netted up. And the sand eels were, just huge schools of sand eel. Bait was smaller, so the rods got shorter and lighter, and I couldn't find the big plugs that I was used to fishing. So, I said, maybe I'll try making my own. Then it was what kind of plug am I going to make? I narrowed it down. I tried I still had a big collection of plugs, and I just started test swimming all those plugs. A lot of people were making Dannies, so I didn't want to. I like metal lip. I like something that swam, on the surface, made a commotion. So I narrowed it down to a Pikkey and a Surfster. I realized that the Pikkey lip, the lip on the Pikkey, it had a lot of potential.
In my personal experience, the Pikkey is so much more versatile than a Surfster. Although the Surfster is a great looking plug and it does what it does wonderfully, it only does one thing. You can't use it in rough water. It stay on a surface. The tail is beautiful, but you need the perfect conditions to use it. So you can't really adjust that for other lure body styles, whatever it is. So I can see why definitely you were drawn to a Pikkey, but you just didn't go for a Pikkey. You went for a giant Pikkey. Like sometimes I feel like people are scared to fish your plugs. Like I know you have the bigger and better kind of a mindset. So when I noticed on your patterns, you paint a lot of big bait fish. Is that the reason behind it?
Yes. In my fishing plugs, fishing colors, I should say, I like to, fish them in bait fish colors best I can. I have my own interpretation, and then I actually take some from Creek Chub, had a lot of variety, and then people will send me pictures of bait fish, and I'll try to. I'm pretty good at, how would I say, copying. I'm a good copier. In that respect. So I can, and I give myself a limited amount of time because, this is a business. So I can't spend days painting one plug. I've got to paint something that looks like a bunker or looks like a weak fish or looks like a porgy and be able to reproduce that, time after time. And it's worked very well, actually.
I'm going to assume there have been some failed over the years where you painted stuff where you just went like, oh, this is not what I thought in mind when you started.
Yes, that's very true. And I'll tell you, what I think of as a good fishing color is not what the general public thinks is a good fishing color. I like browns, blacks, golds. Everybody else likes yellows, purple, chartreuse green.
Yes, I call it the Liberace of lures. They're like the broad range of nice, shiny, happy colors. I did notice that about you when I met you years and years ago. Most of your plugs were brown, even when we fished the Cutty Hunk, and gold. You like those kind of colors. When it comes to retrieving your plugs, a lot of people feel a little intimidated by fishing a pikey. They feel like the plug can only do one thing, basically cast it and retrieve it straight. I know that you feel different about. You use them in different ways. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can either modify it, either by the retrieve or by casting or by bending the lip? What are the things people can do with your plugs?
I never felt that a steady retrieve was the best option in fishing my plugs, let's say. So I'm not casting it out and bringing its steady retrieve. I built my plug to have good action at a slow retrieve, tying direct. Now I realize that probably 90% of the people that fish my plugs use a clip. That frees up the action even more. So that was eye-opening. But anyways, so I break it up. I cast it out. I let it sit till, if I can see if it's a calm night, the waves disappear. I often will get a hit just by that plug, either just kind of floating in the waves or just sitting there, just a big profile sitting on top. And then I'll jerk it twice so the plug actually swims down and floats back up. And then I'll start the retrieve, and I break that retrieve up. I'll speed it up, I'll stop it, I'll give it some sharp jerks on the rod to make it kind of dart. And if I'm really focused, that's how I'm retrieving it. I'll have to admit that, later into the night, I get tired. I'm tired from casting those big plugs, and I get lazy and maybe do a steady retrieve. But if I'm focused, I'm mixing it up, and oftentimes, that'll get me a strike. I'm also using a gel on my plugs, a bunker gel on my plugs, because face it, if you're going to catch a big fish on a big piece of wood, you've got to have more. It can't be just the right action or the right size, or it has glass eyes. It's got to be all those things. So the more I can do to enhance that plug, and I'm doing it.
Well, basically what you're saying is you're trying to maximize your chances by adding all these components together, that gel being one of them. The other one is, if I understand, you have an extra long tails on your plugs. Does that play in? The
initial thinking behind the long tail was, number one, I didn't need a hook on the tail. Even though they're big plugs, I had 2 belly trebles already. Stripers tend to be head hunters, so I'm not hooking any stripers on the unless they fall off the front hook and they get caught by the tail. So I don't need, and plus bluefish come from the tail. So, by adding a hook on the tail, you're inviting bluefish, and I didn't want that. The other idea was, by making the tail as big and long as I could, I was actually adding length to the plug without adding more weight, because weight was the issue. of my plugs. I mean, my surface pike giant that I first started making was 4 ounces. Now, a lot of guys didn't have a rod that would throw 4 ounces. They were using needlefish, they were using rubbers, they were using sand eel patterns and different smaller plugs. They didn't have a rod that could throw my plugs. So, it was almost like a perfect storm. Bunker came back, the rods became more lightweight and could throw a bigger weight. So I've got a rod that I don't no longer have to fish a fiberglass, 11.5-foot fiberglass, Lammy. I've got starting off with a CTS and then going to a Century, where these rods are very, very light and they can throw 10 ounces, no problem.
Speaking on the same subject, you did some testing on a single treble on your plugs. Did you find out anything interesting?
Yeah, so this past year, or last year and part of the year before, I had one good fisherman fishing my plugs and actually cutting off the rear treble. He said not only was it better for the fish, because oftentimes you hook the fish in the front treble and that rear treble is flopping around and it's hooking them in the gills, in the throat, in the eye. If the fish is not a keeper, oftentimes you're harming that fish, even though you're letting it go, but I'm harming it because it's not only hooked in the mouth, fine, but it's hooked in the body. So I like that idea. My concern is that I was into catching fish, and I'm, into catching some bigger fish. So I was, more about catching the fish than, I guess I wasn't thinking about the harming as much. And I'm not hooking that many small fish either, because big plug, if there's small fish around, I often don't even know it because I'm not even getting hit by these smaller fish. But he kept saying, not only are you not going to harm these fish, but you're going to have a better hookup. And what often happens is when you hook a fish in the mouth with the front treble and the rear treble hooks them in the side, they use that leverage to tear out, the front treble. And you often, and that's the thing with metal lips, as you hear, is you lose a lot of fish that you've hooked with metal lips. And, and plus the plug is bigger, so you've got some weight behind that. And the fishes, you can feel the fish go right down to the bottom, rub along the bottom, trying to rub that plug off. All of a sudden, we have fewer stripers, and conservation becomes an issue. For me, who kept a lot of fish because I like to eat fish, and I particularly like to eat striper, it got to the point where I was feeling like I needed to do my part, and I stopped keeping fish. I think 2 years ago I kept one fish. Last year I didn't keep any, and this year, because of the virus, I'm fishing very little. So then I tried it. I started to cut off the rear treble, which my plugs will handle without putting any weights in that second hook hole or whatever, which some people do. You can cut off the rear treble of my plug and it still swims the same relatively. And then I also left the hook protectors on ones that I didn't want to cut the rear treble off. I left the hook protectors on because I know people are going to want to experiment. They want to find out for themselves. They don't want to just say, okay, Gary's doing it, I'm going to do it. So, and then I ended up making my plugs with 2 belly trebles and with a single belly treble. So you had no option. And I get orders where people say, I want a single belly treble, or I get orders to say any plug with 2 hooks. So there's still people out there that, feel stronger that way. But if you want to try it, you can leave the hook protectors on, which is very effective.
Haven't we all done
that
one?
Right. And it works. And I actually got into last spring, I got into a run of big fish. And I say, big fish up to the mid-30s for 4 days in the same spot during a storm. So we went every day. I got a good opportunity to catch a lot of fish just using a single. So I had some plugs that had just one treble, no rear treble, and I had some plugs that had the rear treble covered with hook protectors. And I was shocked, absolutely shocked, how I only lost 2 fish and all the fish that I hooked up with. And both of those were pilot error. One was a lot bigger than I thought it was. It switched directions and I wasn't paying attention, and I loosened up on on the tension. And then another one I tried to horse, close to shore, again, was a bigger fish than I thought, and pulled the hook out of its mouth. But all the rest were hooked in the corner of the mouth. I was absolutely astounded how effective that was. Now, granted, it was one time, I had a spattering of fishing after that and even smaller fish hooked in the side of the mouth, no damage to the rest of the fish. And I'm a believer, even if the stripers came back in a big way and there's just all big fish, I'm saying that for me, the most effective way to hook a big striper now, because big striper is going to take that plug. It's not, I get a lot of bangs, never hook up. I'm just assuming those are small fish. When a big fish wants a plug, he's taking it.
I've never lost more fish on a type of plug than metal lip. I lose more fish on metal lips than any other plugs. And I always blame this on the two hook set. And sometimes when you fight the fish, you can literally feel one of the hooks pull out and you go like, oh, I just lost a hook. I hope this second one just holds, because, the way they played it against each other and the way they go in the bottom and try to dislodge the hook. And a lot of times because the tension, one of the hooks is in the gills and it'll pop off. So I understand all that. And I agree 100%. I always said about the metal lips itself that if you took a piece of 2x4 and stuck a good lip on it, it will swim. It will swim good enough where you're going to say, well, that looks good. So my point is the metal lips are not that difficult to make, just to make, but obviously to make them properly. As we've seen over the years, only few people can actually do that. Who was your biggest inspiration as you were learning how to make lures? Did you take somebody's particular interest in what they were doing? Were you reading a lot? Like you said, you're 3 hours away, and even the internet in those days wasn't what it is today. Like, what gave you the confidence, and who were you looking up to when designing your lures?
So when I decided on a Pikkey, I actually went to Mass Bass had a show, and it was my birthday. And so I treated myself to the show, went out there, and they were actually doing a turning demonstration. So Dave McLeod, who I really admired he made a big Pikkey. I admired his painting for among other things, but he was turning, and Steve, he was actually making lips, cutting them out of stainless steel, bending them by hand, and he was making a lip. So I went there, and I said, I had an old Pikkey. I said, make me this. And they right at the show, they made me, I still have it hanging in my shop, they made me a Pikkey. Dave signed it. Steve cut out the metal lip, put it on the front, and they handed it to me and said, here you go.
I remember Dave's Pikkeys. He was making good stuff in those days. This was quite a few years, I hate to admit.
And then Mike Fixter was making a big Pikkey on the West Coast. And you'd go to a show and you'd see his stuff there. Either he was there or his stuff was there, and he had a very good swimming Pikkey. So I had in my mind the type of action that I wanted, because I had an old plug. So when I was trying to figure out what kind of plug I was using, I went through all my plugs, and I had an old plug somebody had given me, and I took it out during the day. I took all these plugs out during the day at block and just swam them in the daylight to see how, and this one particular plug had a tremendous action on it. And I got it right close to shore, and a striper came out of nowhere, maybe a 15-pound fish, grabs the plug. I hadn't tied the plug on very well because I was just switching so much. And he took the plug right in front of me. So that tremendous action plug that I wanted to duplicate was gone. And that was the only one I had. But I had that in my mind. And I guess, starting off, after I decided on a Pikkey, which I call a pike, it had to be big and it had to swim a certain way. And no matter what kind of lip I put on my big pikes, I couldn't get that action. So I ended up making my own lip. And the first 100 plugs I made, I actually hand cut them out of stainless steel and bent them. And if you know anything about cutting stainless steel, which you might, that's not the way to do it.
I do. I hate whenever my boss gives me a job, he says, you got to put a stainless steel jacketing on a roof. I just can you get somebody else? Because that will just destroy your hands cutting that stuff up. It's just, it's difficult. Although we have the proper tools, it's still difficult.
Sure it is. Yep. So I was, fortunately, he ran into me. Ran into Fred Richie out of Rhode Island, who was a tool and die maker. He saw me at a show doing this, kind of bending my lips by hand, and he asked me what I was doing. So I go to explain to him what I'm doing. He said, I know what you're doing. He said, what the hell are you doing? He said, come see me. I'll help you out. So I didn't, of course. I continued to cut them by hand, and I went to some other people to see if they would make my lip, and it was too much money. And so finally I gave Fred a call, and he said, I said, will you make my lips for me? And he said, no. He said, I wanted 800 lips a year. And he said, it's not worth my time to make you 800 lips a year. But he said, what I'll do is I'll set you up with a screw press and a series of dies that you can make your own lips and right out of your garage. And he didn't say this, but he did it at half price, because I checked in with some other tool and die makers, and they said, wow, he did all that for that. So, he took care of me. He's a great guy. He actually, each lip takes 3 big dies to, you have to first stamp the lip out, then you have to put holes in it, and then you have another die that bends it. So, and I have 4 different lips. So I have a series of dies too, and I have an 800-pound screw press in my garage.
Speaking of lures, I think people are under the impression that lures are simple to make. It's just a piece of wood, and if you're a good artist, you're basically getting compensated for your artistic abilities. But honestly, you as a lure builder, do you think that maybe the public is not aware of just how much it goes into from the actual initial design in your head process to testing and then manufacturing? I forget the sales, that's a whole other thing. Do you think that we sometimes don't give plug builders enough credit?
Speaking for myself, I think you need to be a fisherman, and I think you need to have support. Your wife has to be behind it, because you're going to be spending a lot of time. If you're not retired, which I wasn't until last year, you're stealing time away from your customers, your family, fishing, in order to make a lure. A lure for me, a fishing pike, painted simply, takes me a good hour and a half for one lure. Now, guys would say, "Oh, that's not bad," but you've got to do that. I do it in batches of 30 to 50. So anybody can make one lure, I say, but to reproduce that lure over and over again in relatively the same shape, so it swims and acts the way it's supposed to, is very difficult. And then you were saying that you put a metal lip on a big piece of wood, and I agree. Anybody could do that, but to swim it in rough water, where the tendency is for that metal lip to roll over and kick out. Now that's the skill of a good plug maker.
There's definitely some art to it, because a few metal lip makers that I've got to know over the years have designed the plugs for unusual circumstances and conditions. And most of the people will look at your plug and say, well, this is okay, it's a northwest wind flat, this is the only time I'm throwing it, why am I throwing such a giant thing? Where by experience, and other people do, that your pikeys are just as effective in big, rough water. Do tell me about that, because that always kind of fascinates me. I know I've done it. I've wrote about it. I've wrote it in my book. But most of the people tend to look at that kind of water and go like, I'm going with a bucktail or something, or a bottle plug, something that will dig in. But I know, and I have failed over the years to excite other people about it. But do tell, I want to hear from you. How do you fish your plugs in rough water, considering that's all you fish?
I think my plugs are most effective in rough water, because, on a calm, clear night in crystal clear water, throwing a big plug, fish is going to get a real good look at it. So I'm looking for some rough water, or I'm looking for some white water, because fish isn't getting a very good look at it. It's a big profile, so it shows up really well in that rough water. And my plugs are belly weighted as opposed to chin weighted like the standard Pikkey, where they swim very well in rough water without kicking out. I think that's the key, is the belly weighting. I've made some of mine just for experiment with chin weighting. Swims great, but you put it in some rough water and it's not going to stick in that water because that lip's going to hold it in there. But you've got to have some ballast, and that belly weighting gives it the ballast to stay in that rough water. And and then I guess my biggest contribution to the surf fishing community of all the plugs I make are the divers. I felt, even though I like a surface plug, I always felt that the bigger fish stay deeper. To date, I'd say most of the big fish that have come on my plugs have come on the divers, because at the time when I made it, it would dive far deeper than any wooden plug that floated at rest than anything else on the market. So, to give you an example, my surface plug will dive down to 6 feet. A lot of times people's diving plug dive to 6 feet. My medium diver goes 8 to 10 feet, and my deep diver goes 15
You don't even know how
plus.
much.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as far as I can swim and stand on a rock, I can still hit bottom. I still hit bottom how deep that water is. So.
Speaking of swimming, I'm going to remind you of something. I don't know if you want to be reminded of, but you are the only person that I know that has swam across the channel at Cuttyhunk to go fish the other island. Just for our listeners who are probably not familiar with the story, we were out at the Cuttyhunk one year, and Gary was out there with his crew. I was there with my crew, and the fishing was awful, if I remember. And someone said, Gary swam to the other island during, I guess, the slack water. Is that what happened? I mean, that current is ripping through that inlet. I'm not sure. How did you get to the other side?
It's not as crazy as it sounds, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I had a whole day. I had limited time to figure out what I was going to do. Excuse me. I was on the island for 3 nights, and the first night, there was 30 good surf casters on the island, and nobody caught a fish, including myself. Now, there might have been some really small fish caught, but nobody admitted to it. But nobody caught anything of significance, and that's not like cutty. That's not the cutty I'm used to, and that didn't bode well for 2 more nights. So, a friend in my group did a boat charter the next morning. And they floated down Nashawina, which is the adjacent island, during the day, and they caught stripers all the way down that ocean-side shoreline. So in my mind, as soon as he told me that, I said, wow, I wonder what's there at night. If they're catching, they caught fish up to 20 pounds. So I'm wondering what's there at night. So that's got my attention. And now I'm trying to figure out how to get over to Nashawina, which is a private island. I had the day. And I started doing some research. I talked to Bonnie, who runs the Cuttyhunk Lodge, and I said, Bonnie.
You have to talk to Bonnie. You
got
to get permission from her.
Well, I didn't let her know that I was thinking that way, but I said, Bonnie, what's the deal with Nashawina? And she said, when I was 14, my cousin and I used to swim across the channel and ride the horses on the other island. And she said, we did that all the time until at one point my cousin fell off, broke her arm, and then, of course, we had to be rescued, and that was that. So Bonnie has swum across the channel. And then I talked to a few other people. They said that they had heard that on a new moon, which we were fishing, the water on the low tide, they said you could practically walk across the channel. Okay, so I said, good. That sounds good. I didn't believe that totally, but, if it's reasonable, so I'm thinking, okay. And then, I investigated having a boat drop us off. Of course, that there's all kinds of issues with that. And nobody was really interested in that. We contacted a couple charter guys. And so then I'm thinking, and I never committed that I was going to do this, but it's in my mind and I'm focused. And so I'm thinking that there were some issues. I had to cook dinner that night. I'm not going to be able to walk down to the channel, which is like a 1.5 mile walk, maybe. I'm thinking I'm going to conserve my energy. Instead of walking down and looking at the channel during the day to see what it looks like, I just have in my mind's eye of what it looked like when I fished it the year before. Can't throw a stone across it, but it's not unswimmable from my recollection. So I've got to cook dinner, so I'm not going to get a look at the channel. But the tide was good because I'm thinking if I swim across at the incoming tide, there's going to be less current. And that's what the tide was incoming when I wanted to go at dark. And I'm thinking if I go at night, there's going to be less boat traffic. So less chance of me getting hit by a boat. So, and I'm figuring that on the incoming, the water's coming from the sound through the channel and emptying into the bay, which is still very big. But, the idea of getting washed into the bay as opposed to getting washed into the sound just sounded better, sounds.
Yeah, when you have to explain to your wife why they found you. Yes, I get it.
So, and then I guess I've kind of committed now to myself that I'm going to at least go down and take a look. I'm going to hike down to the channel, and I'm going to see what it feels like when I get down there. So I cooked dinner, and then the last contact I made with anybody was my friend Ted is getting ready to fish, and Ted is a adventurer. I mean, he's a mountain climber, he's a rock climber. He spends his summers in Montana with his extended family that are all smoke jumpers. So, I mean, I consider myself, a reasonable wetsuiter, and I will take, I will test the waves. Because the thing is in big waves, that's when you're tested as a wetsuiter. Because it's one thing to get on the rock, but it's another thing to stay on it. So Ted is fearless. I mean, I've seen him get on a rock 3 times, get washed off 3 times, and he's trying to get on the 4th time. So if there's anybody that might swim across with me, it's Ted. So I said to Ted, Ted, I'm thinking of swimming across the Nashawina. And I looked at him, and he doesn't say anything. He just looks at me, and he goes, huh, and turns around and walks away. Okay, I guess I'm on my own. So then I walked down I went along the shoreline. I went down, which I never rarely do because I don't see very well at night, is go without a light, but I didn't want anybody to see me. So as I'm walking along the shoreline, along the rocks, there's a couple guys fishing the channel. And I thought about leaving one of my pikes in the guy's, he had his shoes on the rocks and an extra jacket. And I felt like I should leave a pike in his shoe just to let him know that was the last place anybody saw me.
That's not funny, but go ahead. Right.
So I didn't do that because I figured I'm going to need all the plugs I had just in case. So I step into the water, and as I'm wading out, I noticed that there's seaweed and some leaves, and they're actually going in the wrong direction of where I think the current should be doing. They're going from the bay to the sound. And I'm thinking, being a freshwater stream fisherman, you get back eddies where the stream's running one way, but there's a back eddy coming back. So I said, that's probably what this is. Because now at this point, I'm committed. I'm wading out. And the last thing I saw was the guy on the shore catch a fish, and it was just a little small striper. And then I started swimming. And all my planning, all my thinking about how I was going to approach this went south at that point because I got swept out into the sound. I got to the farthest point of the island so that I could figure that I would float through the channel, be swept through the channel while I'm trying to swim across. So I'm swimming the shortest distance. And I immediately got swept out into the sound. When I looked back, Cutty Hunk I was out past Cutty Hunk, so there was no going back. And I'm out into the sound, and I could see the silhouette of Nashawina ahead of me, so that's what I swam for. But I immediately am going in the wrong direction. So I'm going to leave it on that note because the statute of limitations with my wife has not run out, and I plan on writing this story. And when I had mentioned that I might write a story like this, I said that I didn't want to end up in the doghouse. And she wrote, when she was editing that comment, again.
Yeah, they made it sound a lot more reasonable because Bonnie swam at 14 in 1936. That's pretty funny, but yeah, that's kind of a cool. Yeah, so listen, I've been in situations where the conversation went that way over dinner, and people were like, "Oh yeah, I read it," and I'm like, "No, no, 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 let's not go there with this conversation." My wife does not need to worry what we do when we do, because sometimes you put yourself in a position that you really didn't plan on, and as you just said, you made this great plan and it just went all wrong, and at the end it worked great and you caught fish and it was all good. But as you can see, it happens quickly. It's not something that you can't plan for everything. Having said that, I remember another story where you had like a 51-pound fish that, according to the plan, didn't go either, right?
Exactly. Because I live 3 hours from the water, when I pick a time to fish, I try to pick a storm coming, but a lot of times it's just I want to fish. I want to wet a line, as my father used to say. So I'll just go and I fish the conditions that I encounter. And because I've driven 3 hours, it's like, if it's too rough or it's too flat, I just go with it. So I've learned to fish in different conditions. And just a side note, that's why I only fish my plugs, because when I started making a pikey, I hadn't fished a lot of pikeys. So I was learning along with everybody else. So I decided to just fish pikeys and fish them in all conditions and find out when they would catch, and more importantly, when they wouldn't, or what would prevent me from fishing them in a certain condition. So when I got to this particular lighthouse, I had talked to some people actually during the day. And I said, "What are the conditions down there?" Because I'm thinking of coming down. And they said, "It's beautiful." Obviously they weren't on the shore, but they said it's beautiful. From what the forecast says, it's maybe waves to a foot and moderate winds. So I drive 3 hours. I get down there, and when I get down to the lighthouse, I look over the seawall, and everything is totally changed. It's wild, absolutely wild. In fact, it's the most wild, and I fished in a hurricane that was coming. I fished prior to that hurricane, right up to the point where you couldn't fish anymore. And the conditions that night were worse than anything I had ever experienced in that spot. The water was at high tide level 2 hours before high tide because of the waves pushing in and the wind. And I'll tell you what, if I hadn't driven 3 hours, I don't know. I say I like to fish big water, but I was intimidated. I was thinking, so my plan changed from, swimming out the rocks and whatever. I'm not swimming in those conditions because I can't even get out. So I'm way up the shoreline and I'm casting, and I had to get myself in position so I could, fish kind of a quarter wind or a crosswind, because I had to get my pikey out in the waves. And I immediately had a hookup. And now I'm thinking, how the heck am I going to land this thing? And I eased up and the fish got off. So that was mad, because I figured that's the only hit I'm going to get in these conditions. And then I went around to the front of the lighthouse, which is very shallow, and I never fish. And I've only caught one teeny schoolie back in the day. It's just too shallow to fish. And there was so much water in there, and the wind was with me. I'm saying, this might be the place. And on the third cast, I hooked into something that I thought was 30 pounds initially. And I caught it between two big rocks. And these huge waves are coming in. So if I don't hook it in those conditions, I'm probably not going to catch this fish, because he's going to just take it and run and go one way or the other around one of those rocks. But because of the big waves, I could hold him till a big wave came. And I actually got him into shallow water pretty quickly. And then I had to work him into shore, and I did it by the waves. I could never reel him in, but I could hold her, I should say, enough that when a wave came, it pushed her a little closer to me until the next wave came. And I did that. And as it got closer, the fish got bigger and heavier, because, I'm saying, wow, this is a serious fish. And I'm fishing a Z bass, left-handed Z bass, which this is the first time I caught a fish with this reel. I had been asking Z bass. I had a Van Staal left-handed, but I liked the smoothness of the Z bass, and I kept asking them when they were going to come out with a left-handed model. They finally did, and I got it 2 days before, and this is the first fish I'm catching on this reel. So it's kind of cool. And I'm fishing. Right, exactly. So, yeah, it was a significant fight, and I got it all the way to shore, and I got it into a place where there's a big sloping rock, and I have to get it over that rock in order to get it down to it. It's deep on the other side of the rock, and in 3 consecutive waves, I got it right to the top of the rock, and then it slid back into the water. And I couldn't get it over the rock, and I finally just said, I could see one of the trebles. It was hooked, both trebles. One of the trebles came loose. So now it's just hooked in the top of the head. And I said, I gotta go for it. I'm going to lose this fish right there. So I got it to the top of the rock, and I horsed it over with my CTS, not my CTS, actually I had a Century rod, that very light rod, but I was amazed at the backbone that rod had to pull that, turns out 50-pound fish over the, dragged it over the top of that rock. And I ran down, covered it because a wave came over the top of both of us. And then I grabbed it in the gills. And when I went to lift it up, I couldn't pick it up all the way off the ground. And I've never had that experience with a fish before. And I just thought it was because I'm fighting the conditions. You're fighting the conditions, you're exhausted. And it was a big fish, but I didn't, it was a heavy fish. And so I dragged it up the rocks to safety. And of course, now it's raining, it's wild. I have to put glasses on, reading glasses on to read my boga. And because they glazed over with water quickly, I can't read the boga. So by holding it up. So then I hung it on the seawall, and because it's leaning against the seawall, it's bouncing up and down in the wind, anywhere between 46 and 50 pounds. So, so I know it's a big fish. And shortly after, I had another guy came. I said, "Can you help me read this?" And he didn't have his glasses on. He's an older guy, so he can't read the boga either. So we still don't know how much this fish weighs. And he starts fishing in my spot. I said, "Go ahead." And he doesn't have a lure that will stay in the water in those conditions with the wind and the waves. So I gave him, not the one I caught the fish on, but gave him another one of my pikeys to fish, because the pikey digs in to big in rough water. It just digs in and it won't come out. So, you got a big wave coming, you can swim that pikey down, wave goes over the top, you let it come back up. And I caught that fish with a surface pikey, but I caught it subsurface in those big waves. So it just shows you how that, and that fish was looking for a big bait. It had 1.5 pound lobster and stung when I cleaned it. So I ended up eating that fish. So I wasn't big on mounts. So, and my wife, she puts enough with my fishing. So we probably weren't going to have that thing hanging on our wall somewhere.
So if the guy wants to buy your lures, where do they go to find them?
Okay. So I do online sales. I do, 3 opportunities. I do shows, which unfortunately may not happen this year. I do online sales. So if you join my website, bigwaterpikes.com, and you join, then you'll get a newsletter that will, give you notice of upcoming sales. And I just sell to my website, the people that join my website. So my website members, and I have 1,500 members that read my newsletter. So, and I also have an auction platform where I auction I call them premium colors, or they're more of the more artistically done. I do some with feathers, jewels, whatever. They still will fish. Everything I make will fish. I don't know if you want to fish, some of those guys. So that's how I do it.
You mentioned you have something new coming up. I know it's been a while since you come up with the new plug, and you're pretty excited over. So tell me, what is it?
I've never been able to duplicate the catching ability of a darter with one of my plugs. with one of my straight pikes. So then, that I felt that was something I needed to investigate. And I kind of went with, Cree Chub did kind of a darter, and it's kind of an unusual looking as opposed to the darters we see today. So I thought I could take a pike body and carve a darter mouth into it and use that slope as the surface. And I wanted to see if I could make it swim. And I actually got it to swim pretty quickly the way I wanted to. Well, actually swam like a darter, where it had a wiggle and it darted from side to side.
Okay, so it didn't just wiggle tight like the pike would. It would just actually went side and then turned the other way and then the other side, like a Z formation.
Yeah, in a very erratic pattern. So I was like, wow, this is it. I did it, and I made it in a slim troller, which was 10 inches. I made it in a giant version, which is 8 inches, a slim, which is a slimmer version, and a junior, which is the smallest plug I make is 6.5 inches. And it swam on all those, opportunities. And I did one more test where I made them all and took them down to test swim them. And it did not swim in the slim version. And I thought I had a quick fix to that, and it still didn't swim. And I thought I had another quick fix to that, and it still didn't swim, and it doesn't swim to this day. So that kind of scared me. And it took me 2 more years of making sure I had the right design, and then that I knew, all the elements of what makes that plug swim, to finally say this is a legitimate plug, a fishing plug. And it's worth, and I wasn't trying to remake the darter, but I was trying to make a darter in a big profile that, and keeping in the pike design for myself. So I could say that I only make pikes.
Oh, well, we are very excited to see this new creation of yours, and looking forward to many more. And I do want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your knowledge and some of your fishing experience with our listeners.
Thank you very much. And I just want to end with one note. I want to commend you and congratulate you on the success with your magazine. I don't know if you remember, but I do very distinctly, is that you asked me before you started this, you asked me what I thought about an online magazine. And I said that, there was a surf casting magazine that came out with like 4 issues and then it disappeared. And I said, I don't think it's going to fly. And I thought you should spend your time fishing. And so here we are, very successful. And then the last thing is, I wonder if you're done writing books, because I had some goals when I first started plug making. One of them was to sell out like Lefty did. And another one was to show up in one of your books. And I didn't make the last book. So in order to feel personally fulfilled as a plug maker,
I feel some pressure now to start writing again.
But, they were always so well received that guys use them like a Bible, for plug fishing.
Well, I appreciate that. Listen, they were labor of love. I mean, that's, how it is. When you do something that you like, it's really not a big deal. Even with this podcast. I mean, this is just so people know. I mean, we're going to get better. This is the first podcast I've ever done. But you know what? It's a labor of love. I'd love to bring you interesting people who are, make our life richer and whose lures we enjoy using and who we might be fishing with. So I'm glad that Gary joined me this morning. We had some technical difficulty to start, but I think we pulled it off pretty good. And if you spend this hour listening to us, well, God bless you.
Thanks for the opportunity.